Picture this. You're a Japanese destroyer captain. March 3rd, 1943. Your convoy of 8 massive transport ships is cruising through the Bismarck Sea, carrying nearly 7,000 troops to reinforce New Guinea. You've done this run a dozen times before. The Americans always show up, sure, but they drop their bombs from 4 miles up like they're trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. Your anti-aircraft crews barely break a sweat anymore. Then at 10:15 a.m., something changes. The American bombers aren't climbing. They're diving. Lower and lower until they're skimming the waves at 50 feet, close enough that you can see the rivets on their wings. And that's when you notice something that makes your blood turn to ice water in your veins. Those aren't bomb bays in the nose of those B-25’s. Those are gun barrels. 8 of them, all pointed directly at your ship. In the next 15 minutes, you're about to witness the most devastating naval massacre in Pacific War history. A massacre that will end Japan's ability to reinforce its island garrisons forever. A massacre that began not in some Pentagon war room, but in the greasy hands of a 6th grade dropout from Arkansas who had a score to settle. What happens when you take a medium bomber designed for high altitude, precision strikes, and turn it into a low-flying demon that can vomit 8 machine guns, worth of death at point-blank range? What happens when American ingenuity meets pure, unbridled rage 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean? The Imperial Japanese Navy was about to find out, and they would never recover from the lesson. But this story doesn't start with that apocalyptic morning in March. It starts 2 years earlier, with a man whose life was destroyed by the very enemy he would learn to kill with ruthless efficiency. This is the story of how Pappy Gunn took everything the Japanese had stolen from him and forged it into a weapon so devastating that it would rewrite the rules of naval warfare forever. Before we dive into this incredible tale of revenge, innovation, and the 15 minutes that changed the Pacific War, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button right now. Because if you love stories about ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things when their backs are against the wall, you're going to want to see every single video we have coming your way. And trust me, what you're about to hear is just the beginning. The year was 1941, and Pappy Gunn was living the American dream in the most unlikely place imaginable. Here was a man who had never made it past 6th grade, who had joined the Navy as a teenager just to escape poverty in Arkansas. He'd taught himself to fly by saving every penny to buy a beat-up surplus seaplane, then built his own airline from nothing in the Philippines. By his 40s, Pappy had a beautiful Filipino wife, 4 children, and a small but thriving business flying passengers and cargo around the islands. Then, on December 8, 1941, the Japanese invasion began, and Pappy Gunn's world exploded. The Japanese military machine rolled through the Philippines like a tidal wave of steel and fire. American and Filipino forces crumbled. Civilians fled in terror. And somewhere in that chaos, Pappy Gunn made a choice that would haunt him and drive him for the next 4 years. As enemy forces closed in, he had to choose: stay and fight a hopeless battle alongside his family, or escape to Australia and live with the knowledge that he had abandoned them to an uncertain fate. He chose survival, but survival came with a price that would eat at his soul every single day. His wife Polly and their 4 children were captured and thrown into the notorious Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where thousands of American civilians would spend years in conditions that tested the very limits of human endurance. Pappy escaped to Australia, but he carried with him the weight of knowing that while he was free, his family was suffering behind barbed wire, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Most men would have been broken by that kind of guilt. Most men would have found a desk job and tried to forget. But Pappy Gunn wasn't most men. The Japanese had taken everything from him: his home, his business, his family, his entire life. And now, every single day he woke up in Australia was another day he would spend figuring out how to make them pay for it. The U.S. Army Air Corps took one look at this grizzled pilot with 20 years of aviation experience and a personal vendetta against the Japanese Empire and commissioned him as a captain. They thought they were getting a maintenance officer. What they actually got was a man who would spend the next 2 years transforming American air power in the Pacific from a clumsy giant into a precision killing machine. Because Pappy Gunn understood something that the generals in their comfortable headquarters didn't understand. You don't win a war by following the textbook. You win a war by taking the textbook, tearing it up, and writing a new one with the blood of your enemies. But before Pappy could write that new textbook, he had to watch the old one fail spectacularly, again and again and again. By early 1942, the situation in the Pacific was nothing short of catastrophic for the Allies. The Japanese had seized territory stretching from Alaska to Australia, and they were reinforcing their positions with massive supply convoys protected by destroyers, cruisers, and air cover. These convoys were the lifeblood of Japanese expansion. Without them, their island garrisons would wither and die. Stop the convoys, win the war. Simple in theory. Nearly impossible in practice. The Allied bomber crews were trying their best, but they were fighting with yesterday's tactics against tomorrow's enemy. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would climb to 20,000 feet and drop their bombs toward fast-moving ships far below, hoping against hope that their high-explosive packages would find their targets. It was like trying to shoot a jackrabbit from the moon with a slingshot. The math was simple and brutal. At 20,000 feet, a B-17's bomb sight had to calculate the movement of the target, the wind speed at multiple altitudes, the temperature, the weight of the bombs, and a dozen other variables. And ships, unlike cities or factories, had this annoying habit of changing course and speed without warning. The results were pathetic. Mission after mission returned with reports of near misses and possible hits. Reconnaissance photos showed Japanese convoys steaming serenely toward their destinations, completely unharmed by the hundreds of tons of high explosives that had been dropped all around them. American air crews were dying to accomplish absolutely nothing, and Japanese supplies were getting through at a rate that made victory seem impossible. In the maintenance hangars of the 5th Air Force, Pappy Gunn watched this failure with the cold fury of a man who knew that every successful Japanese convoy meant another day his family would spend in captivity. And as he watched, an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so radical, so against everything the Air Corps had taught about proper bombing technique, that it would have gotten him court-martialed if he'd suggested it in a formal briefing. But Pappy Gunn wasn't interested in formal briefings anymore. He was interested in dead Japanese. The idea was elegantly simple and completely insane. Instead of trying to hit ships from 4 miles up, why not get down low? Instead of dropping bombs and hoping they'd hit something, why not turn the bomber itself into a massive machine gun that could rake the target from stem to stern? Why not get so close that missing would be physically impossible? Every single regulation in the Army Air Corps manual said this was suicide. You don't take a twin-engine bomber down to wave-top height, where every enemy sailor with a rifle could take pot shots at you. You don't modify military aircraft without authorization from headquarters. You don't turn precision bombers into flying gun platforms because that's not what they were designed for. Paul Gunn didn't give a damn about any of that. The Japanese had his family, and the rulebook wasn't getting them back. Working in secret with North American Aviation's field representative Jack Fox, Pappy began what would become the most successful unauthorized weapons modification in military history. They started with B-25 Mitchell bombers, twin-engine aircraft that were fast, tough, and just big enough to carry the modifications Pappy had in mind. The first step was to strip out the bombardier's position in the nose, that glass-enclosed compartment where a man would normally sit with his Norden bomb sight, trying to calculate precision drops from high altitude. Pappy had a different use for that space. He wanted to fill it with machine guns. Lots of machine guns. The first experimental aircraft got 450 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, all fixed to fire straight ahead. The pilot would aim the entire airplane like a fighter, but with 4 times the firepower of any fighter aircraft in the Pacific. The guns were salvaged from wrecked P-40 Warhawks and P-39 era Cobras, aircraft that had been shot down or crashed, but whose weapons could still deal death. 4 guns became 6. 6 became 8. Each gun could fire 750 rounds per minute, which meant that a single B-25 with 8 nose guns could pour 6,000 rounds per minute into a target. For comparison, that was more firepower than an entire company of infantry could produce with their rifles and machine guns combined. It was enough firepower to literally saw a ship in half, but the guns were only half of Pappy's revolutionary equation. The other half was a bombing technique so dangerous that it had been banned by most air forces as too risky: skip bombing. Skip bombing worked exactly like it sounded. A pilot would roar in at wave-top height, release his bombs at just the right moment and angle, and watch them skip across the water like flat stones thrown by children at a lake. The bombs would bounce once, twice, sometimes 3 times before slamming into the side of the target ship right at the waterline, the most vulnerable part of any vessel's hull. A bomb that hit at the waterline would punch through the ship's side and explode inside, causing catastrophic flooding that was almost impossible to control. The technique required incredible skill and nerves of steel. The pilot had to approach the target at exactly the right speed and altitude, release the bombs at precisely the right moment, and then pull up and away before the explosion could damage his own aircraft. He had to do all of this while enemy anti-aircraft guns were shooting at him from point-blank range, while his own machine guns were blazing away at the target's deck, and while flying so low that the slightest mistake would send him cartwheeling into the ocean. It was the kind of flying that separated the men from the boys, and the living from the dead. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, was initially skeptical when Pappy showed him the first modified B-25. Here, was this grizzled maintenance officer claiming that he could revolutionize naval warfare with some salvaged machine guns and a technique that most experts considered barely controlled suicide. But Kenney was a practical man, and the current tactics weren't working. When Pappy's modified bomber completed its first test flights and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of its 8-gun nose, Kenney gave him something that most military innovators only dream of: complete authorization to modify as many aircraft as he could get his hands on. By the end of 1942, Pappy's workshop had become the most important facility in the Pacific that nobody had ever heard of. Working around the clock, his team of mechanics and armorers were converting entire squadrons of B-25's into the flying gunships that would soon terrorize the Japanese Navy. They refined the installation process, improved the gun mountings, and trained pilots in the deadly art of skip bombing and low-level strafing. But all of this preparation was theoretical until it could be tested in combat. And in March of 1943, the Japanese Navy was about to provide the perfect opportunity for that test. Intelligence reports were flooding in about a massive Japanese convoy preparing to leave Rabaul, the heavily fortified enemy base on New Britain. This wasn't just another supply run. This was a major reinforcement operation designed to strengthen Japanese positions in New Guinea and potentially launch a new offensive that could threaten Australia itself. 8 large transport ships, each packed with troops, equipment, and supplies. 8 destroyers as escorts, bristling with anti-aircraft guns and experienced crews who had been fighting in the Pacific for over a year. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen, all steaming directly into the killing zone where Pappy Gunn's modified bombers were waiting. The Japanese were confident. They had made this run before, many times, and the Americans had never managed to stop them. Sure, they would lose a few men to high-altitude bombing, but the vast majority of the convoy would get through, just like always. Their intelligence told them that American bomber tactics hadn't changed. High-altitude attacks, poor accuracy, minimal damage. Just another routine mission through contested waters. They had no idea that the rules of the game had changed completely. At this point, you might be wondering, how did one man's garage workshop modifications become so important that they could change the entire course of the Pacific War? I mean, we're talking about 8 machine guns bolted into the nose of a bomber. How much difference could that really make? If you're thinking that, then you're about to get a lesson in why the details matter when it comes to warfare. But before we get to that lesson, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now if you're enjoying this story, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me, what's the most incredible example of battlefield innovation you've ever heard of? I love reading your responses, and some of the stories you share are absolutely incredible. Now back to March 1943, and the morning that changed everything. The Japanese convoy designated as Operation 81 departed Rabaul on March 1, 1943. 8 Maru-class transport ships, each capable of carrying nearly 1,000 men plus equipment and supplies. The Kyokusei Maru, Teiyo Maru, Nojima Maru, Ayo Maru, Takanami Maru, Sinai Maru, Kembu Maru, and Oigawa Maru, names that would be written in water before the week was out. Escorting them were 8 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack and dozens of Pacific engagements. This was the largest reinforcement convoy the Japanese had attempted to send to New Guinea since the beginning of the war. Success would give them the manpower and supplies needed to launch a major offensive against Allied positions in Papua New Guinea and potentially threaten the Australian mainland. Failure would leave their existing garrisons vulnerable and isolated. The Japanese weren't taking any chances. In addition to the destroyer escort, they had arranged for land-based fighter cover from Rabaul, and they were taking a route that would minimize their exposure to Allied air attack. The convoy would hug the coast of New Britain, then make a dash across the Bismarck Sea to Lae on the northern coast of New Guinea. Total transit time, less than 3 days. What could go wrong? Allied intelligence was tracking the convoy from the moment it left port. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the ship count, the escort strength, and the probable destination. General Kenny knew this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to test Pappy Gunn's revolutionary tactics against a major Japanese naval force under combat conditions. The attack plan was elegantly simple. High-altitude B-17's would attack first, forcing the convoy to take evasive action and disrupting their formation. Then, while the Japanese were focused on the threat from above, Pappy's modified B-25's would come in at wave-top height for the killing blow. Skip bombing and 8-gun strafing runs would turn the convoy into floating wreckage. On paper, it looked feasible. In reality, nobody knew if it would work. Skip bombing had been tested in training, but never against a heavily defended target shooting back with everything it had. The 8-gun nose installations were devastating against ground targets, but ships were different. Ships had thick steel hulls, multiple compartments, and crews trained in damage control. Most importantly, ships could shoot back. March the 2nd passed with scattered attacks and skirmishes. B-17's from high altitude scored a few hits, but nothing decisive. Japanese fighters from Rabaul engaged Allied bombers and fighters in running battles above the convoy. By nightfall, the Japanese had lost 1 transport to a lucky bomb hit, but 7 ships were still steaming toward New Guinea with most of their cargo intact. The Japanese naval commanders were satisfied. They had expected to lose 1 or 2 ships to Allied bombing. That was simply the cost of doing business in contested waters. 7 transports would still land more than enough troops and supplies to accomplish their mission. They radioed Rabaul that Operation 81 was proceeding according to plan. That night, in Allied airfields across New Guinea and northern Australia, mechanics worked by lamplight to load ammunition and fuel Pappy Gunn's modified B-25's. Armorers fed long belts of 50 caliber rounds into the 8 guns mounted in each aircraft's nose. Bomb crews loaded 500-pound skip bombs into the modified bomb bays. Pilots checked and rechecked their maps, studying the approach routes that would bring them in at wave-top height for maximum surprise. None of them knew if they would be alive at the end of the next day, but they all knew that they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before in the history of warfare. March 3rd, 1943. Dawned clear and calm over the Bismarck Sea. Perfect flying weather. Perfect killing weather. At 10 a.m., the Japanese convoy was steaming in a neat formation about 20 miles north of Cape Ward Hunt on the New Guinea coast. The destroyers formed a protective screen around the remaining 7 transports, their crews scanning the sky for the inevitable American bomber attack. Everyone was alert, everyone was ready, but everyone was also confident. After 18 months of war in the Pacific, they had seen everything the Americans could throw at them. They were wrong. At 10:15 a.m., 13 B-25 Mitchell bombers appeared on the horizon, flying so low that their propeller wash was kicking up spray from the wavetops. Japanese lookouts shouted warnings. Anti-aircraft guns swung toward the targets. and sailors braced for another routine bombing attack. Then the Americans opened fire, and the routine ended forever. Imagine being on the deck of one of those Japanese ships in that moment. You're expecting bombs to fall from the sky like they always do. Instead, you see the noses of those bombers light up like Christmas trees as 8 machine guns per aircraft begin vomiting tracers and armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute per plane. Suddenly, the air is full of lead, more lead than you've ever seen in your entire life, all of it aimed directly at your ship. The effect was beyond devastating. It was apocalyptic. 104 heavy machine guns, all firing at once, pouring nearly 80,000 rounds per minute into the Japanese formation. The firepower was so intense that it was visible from miles away, a continuous sheet of tracers connecting the American bombers to their targets like deadly threads of light. The sound was indescribable, a continuous roar that could be heard above the engines, above the explosions, above the screams of wounded men. But the machine guns were just the opening act. As the B-25's roared across the convoy at masthead height, they released their skip bombs with surgical precision. The 500-pound bombs bounced across the water like stones, slamming into ship after ship exactly at the waterline where they would do maximum damage. The Kyokusei Maru took the first bomb hit, a 500-pounder that punched through her hull and exploded in her engine room. The blast killed the engine crew instantly and flooded the ship's power plant, leaving her dead in the water. Before her crew could even assess the damage, 2 more B-25's raked her from stem to stern with machine gun fire, killing anyone who tried to fight the fires or launch lifeboats. The Kembu Maru lasted less than 5 minutes. Skip bombs opened her hull in 3 places while machine gun fire swept her deck clean of every living thing. She rolled over and sank so quickly that most of her crew never had a chance to abandon ship. The destroyer Shirayuki tried to fight back, her anti-aircraft guns blazing away at the low-flying bombers. But you can't fight back effectively when 8 machine guns are systematically destroying your gun crews and everything else on your deck. The B-25's were so close that Japanese sailors could see the faces of American gunners as they poured fire into the ship. Some of the bombers passed so low over their targets that they had to climb to avoid hitting the ship's masts. In the space of 15 minutes, the most powerful naval convoy Japan had sent into the Bismarck Sea was transformed into a collection of sinking wrecks and floating bodies. 8 transports and 4 destroyers, sunk or sinking. Nearly 7,000 men, most of them now dead or dying in the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. The few survivors who made it to life rafts or debris would spend days in the water before rescue, and many of them wouldn't survive the experience. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real story is what happened to Japanese naval strategy after March 3, 1943. Before the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, Japanese commanders believed they could reinforce their island garrisons almost at will. Allied bomber attacks were a manageable risk, something to be planned for and endured, but not something that could stop a well-escorted convoy from reaching its destination. After March 3rd, that confidence was shattered forever. The Japanese Navy never again attempted to send a large surface convoy through contested waters in daylight. The risk was simply too great. Instead, they were forced to rely on submarines, fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness, and other methods that could only transport a fraction of the men and supplies their island garrisons needed. The era of massive Japanese expansion was over, ended not by a great fleet battle or an amphibious invasion, but by 13 modified bombers flown by men who refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways. Paul Pappy Gunn had achieved his revenge in the most complete way possible. The Japanese had taken his family from him, and in return, he had taken their ability to win the war. But Pappy's story doesn't end with the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. It gets even more incredible from there, because this man, who had started as a maintenance officer, was about to become one of the most important weapons innovators of the entire war. His 8-gun nose was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Pappy and his team would develop new weapons, new tactics, and new modifications that would make Allied aircraft even more deadly. They created the first practical rocket installations for medium bombers, allowing B-25's to carry and fire 5-inch naval rockets against ground targets. They developed new gun installations that could mount as many as 14 machine guns in a single aircraft. They perfected skip bombing techniques that could place a 1,000-pound bomb through the window of a building from a mile away. But perhaps more importantly, Pappy proved that innovation doesn't come from committees or bureaucracies. It comes from individuals who are willing to ignore the rule book when the rule book isn't working. His modifications were copied throughout the Pacific Theater and eventually became standard equipment for ground attack aircraft. The tactics he developed at his small workshop in Australia were taught at training schools across the United States. And his family? In February 1945, American forces liberated the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Pappy Gunn and her 4 children had survived 4 years of captivity, sustained by the knowledge that somewhere out there, Pappy was fighting to get them back. When they were reunited, Pappy Gunn finally had everything that had been taken from him. Well, almost everything. The Japanese had stolen 4 years of his life with his family, and no amount of revenge could give those back. But he had ensured that they would never steal anything from anyone else again. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was more than just a military victory. It was a demonstration of what Americans could accomplish when their backs were against the wall and they were free to think outside the box. It showed that sometimes the most important innovations come not from the top down, but from the bottom up, from the hands of mechanics and pilots who understand problems that generals have never seen. Most importantly, it proved that in warfare, as in life, the people who are willing to break the rules are often the ones who end up changing the world. Pappy Gunn returned to the United States after the war and spent his remaining years as a test pilot, continuing to push the boundaries of what aircraft could do. He died in 1957 at the age of 57 while testing a new experimental aircraft. He was doing what he had always done, taking risks to make flying better and safer for the people who would come after him. The B-25 Mitchell bombers that he modified went on to serve throughout the Pacific War, sinking hundreds of Japanese ships and destroying thousands of ground targets. His 8-gun nose installation became so famous that it was featured in movies, documentaries, and history books. But for Pappy, the fame was never the point. The point was getting his family back and making sure that no other American family would have to go through what his had endured. In that, he succeeded completely. Today, when we look at precision weapons and smart bombs and all the high-tech gadgets that modern military forces use to destroy their enemies, it's easy to forget that some of the most effective weapons in history were created by people working with hand tools in makeshift workshops. Pappy Gunn's 8-gun nose wasn't designed by a computer or tested in a laboratory. It was built by men who understood that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to grab some tools and start building a solution. The Japanese learned this lesson the hard way on March 3, 1943. They discovered that American ingenuity, fueled by righteous anger and backed by the industrial might of a continent, could create weapons they had never imagined. They found out that when you corner Americans and threaten their families, you don't get surrender. You get innovation. You get solutions. And sometimes, you get weapons that can change the entire course of a war in 15 minutes. If you've made it this far in the story, then you understand why these tales of American ingenuity and determination are so important to tell. They remind us that our greatest strength as a nation has always been our ability to adapt, to innovate, and to find new solutions when the old ones aren't working. That's as true today as it was in 1943. So here's what I need you to do. If you want to see more stories like this one, stories about the incredible machines and unsung heroes who shaped our history, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. We've got dozens of these stories coming your way, each one more incredible than the last. And trust me, you don't want to miss what we have planned next. While you're at it, check out our video about the most unusual aircraft modifications of World War II. You'll be amazed at what desperate men can accomplish with the right tools and the wrong attitude. And drop a comment below telling me what you thought of Pappy Gunn's story. Do you think his innovations could have been developed through official channels, or did it take someone willing to break the rules to make it happen? The Battle of the Bismarck Sea lasted 15 minutes, but its effects lasted for the rest of the war. One man's workshop modifications changed the balance of power in the Pacific and helped ensure that democracy would survive its greatest test. That's the power of American innovation, and that's why these stories matter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Picture this. It's October 27th, 1948. The courtroom at Nuremberg is dead silent. In the dock sits a gray-haired man in a simple suit, his hands folded calmly in his lap. This is Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, one of Hitler's most ruthless air commanders, the man whose bombers turned the ancient Basque town of Guernica into a blazing inferno, the architect of the London Blitz that killed over 40,000 innocent civilians. For 3 years, prosecutors have been building their case, assembling mountains of evidence, testimonies, and documents that seem to paint an ironclad picture of guilt. The judge clears his throat. The entire world is watching. Justice, it seems, is about to be served. And then, the unthinkable happens. Not guilty on all counts. The gavel comes down. Hugo Sperle, one of the most senior Nazis to escape the gallows, walks out of that courtroom a free man. While his colleagues faced firing squads and nooses, this architect of terror bombing simply disappeared into the shadows of post-war Germany. How is this possible? How does a man who commanded the destruction of entire cities, who pioneered the tactics of terror bombing that would define modern warfare, simply walk away from the greatest war crimes trial in history? The answer will shock you, because it reveals not just the story of one man's escape from justice, but the dark political calculations that allowed some of history's worst war criminals to slip through the cracks. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about justice after World War II. And I guarantee you, by the end of this story, you'll be questioning whether true justice was ever really possible in the shadow of the Cold War. But first, if you're ready to dive deep into one of history's most shocking cover-ups, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. What's the most outrageous example of someone escaping justice that you've ever heard of? Hugo Sperle wasn't born evil. That's perhaps the most terrifying thing about his story. He emerged from the kind of respectable, middle-class German family that you'd find in any town across the Kaiser's empire in the late 1800s. Born on February 7, 1885, in Ludwigsburg, Württemberg, he was the son of a brewery worker who had managed to climb into the lower rungs of the middle class. In those days, for a young man of modest means but burning ambition, there was really only one path to honor, respect, and advancement: the army. At 19, young Hugo Sperle made a decision that would shape the rest of his life and, ultimately, the fate of thousands of innocent civilians. He enlisted in the Royal Württemberg Army as an officer cadet. This wasn't just a career choice. It was a complete transformation of identity. The military of Imperial Germany wasn't just an institution. It was a religion with its own code of honor, its own rigid hierarchy, and its own particular brand of Prussian discipline that would forge boys into professional killers. But here's where Sperle's story takes its first crucial turn. When World War I erupted in August 1914, he wasn't dreaming of aerial combat or strategic bombing. He was a simple artillery captain, learning his trade in the mud and blood of the Western Front. For 2 grinding years, he served with the heavy artillery, mastering the brutal mathematics of destruction, calculating trajectories, coordinating barrages, watching entire landscapes disappear under clouds of smoke and steel. Then something happened that would change everything. In 1916, Sperle looked up from the trenches and saw the future of warfare soaring overhead. The airplane, barely more than a flying death trap at the time, had captured his imagination. But this wasn't about glory or romance. Sperle was too calculating for that. He saw something that most of his contemporaries missed. Air power wasn't just a novelty or a sideshow. It was going to be the decisive factor in future wars. The transfer to the Imperial German Air Service wasn't easy. Flying in 1916 was essentially a suicide mission. The life expectancy of a combat pilot was measured in weeks, not months. But Sperle didn't want to be a fighter ace hunting for individual glory. He wanted to understand the bigger picture. He trained as an observer first, learning to see battlefields from above, to coordinate air and ground operations, to think strategically about how air power could be used not just tactically, but as a weapon of terror and intimidation. By the time the war ended in Germany's crushing defeat, Hugo Sperle had absorbed a lesson that would haunt the world for decades to come. Air power wasn't just about military targets. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight by striking at their most vulnerable points: their cities, their civilians, their sense of safety and security. The Treaty of Versailles tried to bury this lesson along with German military ambitions. Germany was forbidden from having an air force. German officers were forbidden from even thinking about air warfare. But men like Hugo Sperle didn't just disappear. They went underground. Through the 1920s, while working officially in civilian aviation or serving in the tiny restricted German army, Sperle and dozens of other former Imperial Air Service officers kept the flame alive. They studied foreign air forces, developed theories of strategic bombing, and waited for their moment. That moment came on January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. For Hugo Sperle, now 48 years old and still burning with ambition, this was the resurrection he had been waiting for his entire adult life. Within months, the secret German Air Force that had been developing in the shadows was revealed to the world as the Luftwaffe. And Sperle, with his 2 decades of experience and his deep understanding of air warfare, was perfectly positioned to ride this wave to power. But even Hitler's inner circle probably couldn't have predicted how quickly and completely Sperle would transform from a relatively obscure artillery officer into one of the most feared air commanders in the world. By 1936, he held the rank of general major and had been selected for what would become his first true test of command and his first war crime. The Spanish Civil War erupted in July 1936, and for Nazi Germany, it represented the perfect opportunity. Officially, Germany would remain neutral. Unofficially, Hitler saw Spain as a testing ground for his new military machine. The mission was simple: help General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces defeat the Spanish Republic, gain valuable combat experience, and test new weapons and tactics in real warfare conditions. But this wasn't just any military intervention. This was the birth of modern terror bombing, and Hugo Sperle, now commanding the so-called Condor Legion, was about to write his name into the history books with blood and fire. The Condor Legion was supposedly a volunteer force made up of German pilots and ground crew who had resigned from the Luftwaffe to fight for Franco. In reality, it was a fully operational German Air Force unit, complete with the latest aircraft, the most experienced pilots, and a mandate to test the absolute limits of air power as a weapon of war. Under Sperle's command, the Condor Legion didn't just provide tactical support to Franco's ground forces. They systematically developed and refined the tactics of terror bombing that would later devastate cities across Europe. They experimented with different types of bombs, different attack patterns, different methods of maximizing civilian casualties and psychological impact, and then came April 26, 1937, the day that Hugo Sperle's name became synonymous with one of the most infamous war crimes of the 20th century. Guernica was a small Basque town in northern Spain, with a population of about 5,000 people. It held deep cultural and historical significance for the Basque people. Their traditional parliament met under the famous oak tree of Guernica, making it a symbol of Basque autonomy and identity. But militarily, it was essentially irrelevant. There were no major military installations, no strategic industries, no vital transportation hubs. What Guernica did have was something much more valuable to the Nazi war machine. It was the perfect laboratory for testing the psychological effects of total aerial destruction on a civilian population. At 4:30 p.m., on that Monday afternoon, the market square was packed with civilians going about their daily business. Children were playing in the streets. Families were shopping for dinner. And then the first wave of Heinkel He-111 bombers appeared on the horizon. For the next 3.5 hours, Sperle's Condor Legion conducted what can only be described as a systematic experiment in terror. Wave after wave of bombers dropped explosive bombs, incendiary bombs, and fragmentation bombs on the defenseless town. When people tried to flee, fighter planes strafed them with machine gun fire. When buildings caught fire, more incendiaries were dropped to feed the flames. The numbers alone tell only part of the story. 70% of Guernica was completely destroyed. Hundreds of civilians were killed. The exact number remains disputed to this day because so many bodies were simply incinerated. But the real significance of Guernica wasn't in the casualty figures. It was in the message that Hugo Sperle and the Nazi war machine were sending to the world. This is what happens to anyone who dares to resist us. Pablo Picasso captured the horror of what Sperle had unleashed in his famous painting Guernica, a fractured, nightmarish vision of civilian suffering that became one of the most powerful anti-war images ever created. But for Hugo Sperle, Guernica wasn't a war crime. It was a success story. It was proof that air power could be used not just to destroy military targets, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. The bombing of Guernica made headlines around the world. But the international community did nothing. The League of Nations issued condemnations. Newspapers wrote editorials. And Hugo Sperle took careful notes on everything that had worked and everything that could be improved for next time. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 with Franco's victory, Sperle returned to Germany as a conquering hero. He had proven that the theories of strategic bombing developed in secret during the 1920s actually worked. He had field-tested the weapons and tactics that would soon be unleashed on a much larger scale. And he had demonstrated that the German people and indeed the world had the stomach for total war against civilian populations. Hitler was so pleased with Sperle's performance in Spain that he immediately promoted him to command Luftflotte 3, one of the Luftwaffe's primary air fleets. By 1938, as Nazi Germany prepared for its next phase of expansion, Hugo Sperle commanded over 200 aircraft and 180,000 personnel. He was no longer just a field commander. He was one of the architects of Hitler's military machine. But the real test was still to come. And when World War II finally exploded across Europe in September 1939, Hugo Sperle was ready to apply everything he had learned in the Spanish laboratory on a scale that would dwarf even his own worst nightmares. If you're finding this deep dive into the making of a war criminal as disturbing as it is fascinating, now would be a perfect time to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What we're about to explore next, Sperle's role in the destruction of France and the terror bombing of Britain, shows how the lessons of Guernica were applied on an industrial scale. And trust me, you won't want to miss how this story connects to some of the most controversial decisions made at the Nuremberg trials. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Hugo Sperle's Luftflotte 3 wasn't initially involved in the action. But this gave him time to prepare for what everyone knew was coming next, the assault on Western Europe. Throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940, known as the Phony War, Sperle was busy planning what would become one of the most devastating air campaigns in military history. The German attack on France and the Low Countries, launched on May 10, 1940, wasn't just a military operation. It was the full-scale implementation of everything Hugo Sperle had learned about combining air and ground warfare. His Luftflotte 3, now numbering over 2,400 aircraft, was tasked with supporting Army Group A's advance through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, while also conducting strategic bombing missions deep into Allied territory. But Sperle didn't just follow the standard playbook. He had learned from Guernica that air power was most effective when it created maximum psychological impact. So while his tactical bombers supported the German ground advance, his strategic bombers targeted civilian infrastructure behind enemy lines. Bridges, railway stations, refugee columns, even hospitals bearing the Red Cross. Nothing was off limits if it could spread panic and confusion among the Allied forces and civilian populations. The results were devastating and immediate. Within just 6 weeks, France, the great military power that had stood against Germany in World War I for 4 bloody years, was completely defeated. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, and by June 22, France had signed an armistice agreement that left the country divided and occupied. Hugo Sperle's air fleet had been instrumental in this stunning victory. His bombers had shattered French morale, disrupted Allied communications, and demonstrated to the world that the combination of air and ground warfare, what the Germans called blitzkrieg, could achieve in weeks what had taken years to accomplish in the previous war. The victory in France earned Spurl his field marshal's baton, making him one of only 12 Luftwaffe officers to achieve this highest rank. At 55 years old, he was now at the absolute pinnacle of Nazi Germany's military hierarchy, commanding respect from Hitler himself and wielding power over an air force that had proven itself invincible. But the greatest test was yet to come. With France defeated, Hitler's attention turned to the one remaining obstacle to German domination of Europe, Great Britain. The plan was simple in concept, but unprecedented in scale. First, Sperl's Luftflotte 3, working in coordination with other German air fleets, would destroy the Royal Air Force in aerial combat. Once British air defenses were eliminated, German bombers would systematically destroy British industrial capacity, military installations, and transportation networks. Finally, with Britain defenseless and demoralized, German ground forces would launch Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. What followed was the Battle of Britain, the first purely aerial campaign in military history. For nearly 4 months, from July through October 1940, Hugo Spurl's air fleet engaged in daily combat with the Royal Air Force over the skies of southern England. Initially, Spurl focused his attacks on RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. This was military strategy in its purest form. Destroy the enemy's capacity to fight back, then achieve air superiority. But the British proved remarkably resilient. Despite heavy losses, RAF Fighter Command continued to put up effective resistance. British pilots, fighting over their own territory with the advantage of radar warning systems, were inflicting unsustainable losses on Spurl's bomber formations. By September 1940, it was clear that the original strategy wasn't working. The RAF wasn't being destroyed, British industrial production wasn't being significantly disrupted, and German bomber losses were mounting dangerously. Hitler and the German High Command faced a critical decision: continue the military campaign against British air defenses, or shift to a strategy of terror bombing designed to break British civilian morale. They chose terror. And Hugo Spurl, the architect of Guernica, was ready to implement everything he had learned about psychological warfare on the largest scale yet attempted. On September 7, 1940, Spurl launched the first major bombing raid of what would become known as the London Blitz. Over 300 German bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, attacked the London docks and East End neighborhoods in broad daylight. The raid killed 436 civilians and seriously injured 1,600 more. But this was just the beginning. For the next 57 consecutive nights, Hugo Spurl's bombers returned to London. Night after night, hundreds of aircraft dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs on Britain's capital city. The attacks weren't random. They were carefully planned to maximize civilian casualties and psychological impact. Spurl's bomber crews targeted working-class neighborhoods where families were packed into small houses with inadequate air raid shelters. They dropped a combination of high-explosive bombs to destroy buildings and incendiary bombs to start fires that would spread rapidly through densely populated areas. They timed their attacks to hit during evening hours when people would be at home with their families, maximizing the emotional trauma. The statistics of the London Blitz read like a catalog of war crimes. Between September 7, 1940, and May 11, 1941, Spurl's Luftflotte 3 and other German air units killed 43,000 British civilians and seriously injured another 139,000. Over 1 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. But London wasn't the only target. Spurl's bombers also attacked Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, and dozens of other British cities and towns. The attack on Coventry on November 14, 1940, was particularly devastating. Over 500 civilians were killed in a single night, and the city's medieval cathedral was completely destroyed. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, even coined a new word to describe what Spurl was doing: Coventrier, meaning to destroy a city so completely that it ceases to exist as a functioning urban center. This wasn't just military action, it was cultural genocide, an attempt to erase British civilization itself. Throughout this campaign of terror, Hugo Sperle maintained that he was simply following orders and conducting legitimate military operations. When questioned after the war about the targeting of civilians, he consistently argued that British cities were legitimate military targets because they contained war industries and transportation hubs. But the evidence suggests something far more sinister. Intercepted German communications from the period show that Sperle and other Luftwaffe commanders were explicitly targeting civilian areas with the goal of breaking British morale. They weren't trying to destroy military targets. They were trying to terrorize the British people into demanding that their government negotiate a surrender. The strategy failed completely. British morale didn't break. War production actually increased during the Blitz as factories were dispersed and protected. And most importantly, from a military perspective, the RAF wasn't significantly weakened by the shift to terror bombing, meaning that Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain, had to be postponed indefinitely. But for Hugo Sperle, the failure of the Blitz wasn't a lesson in the limitations of terror bombing. It was simply a temporary setback. Throughout 1941 and 1942, as his remaining aircraft conducted sporadic raids on British cities, he continued to refine his tactics and plan for future campaigns. What Sperle couldn't have known was that the Blitz had marked the high point of German air power. From 1943 onward, as Allied bomber production reached industrial levels and British and American air forces began their own strategic bombing campaigns against German cities, Luftflotte 3 found itself increasingly on the defensive. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and as Allied bombers began appearing over German cities in ever-increasing numbers, Hugo Sperle would discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the kind of total war he had pioneered. By 1943, the situation for Sperle's Luftflotte 3 had become increasingly desperate. The command that had once terrorized Europe with over 1,400 aircraft was now struggling to maintain basic defensive operations with fewer than 300 serviceable planes. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the overwhelming industrial capacity of the Allied war machine had turned the once mighty Luftwaffe into a shadow of its former self. But Hugo Sperle's greatest humiliation was yet to come. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces launched the D-Day invasion of Normandy, Sperle's air fleet was supposed to provide the primary aerial defense of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This was the moment when 25 years of German air power development, 8 years of Nazi military preparation, and 4 years of World War would be put to the ultimate test. The results were catastrophic. On D-Day itself, Sperle managed to launch exactly 26 sorties against the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 26 aircraft against an Allied force of over 13,000 planes. The Luftwaffe, which had once darkened the skies over London, was essentially absent from the most crucial battle of the war. Within hours of the invasion, it was clear that Sperle's defensive plans had collapsed completely. Allied aircraft roamed freely over the battlefield, providing close air support to ground troops, interdicting German supply lines, and maintaining complete air superiority. German ground forces, accustomed to operating under friendly air cover, found themselves exposed and vulnerable to constant aerial attack. The failure at D-Day marked the end of Hugo Sperle's military career. By August 1944, with Allied forces breaking out of Normandy and racing across France, Hitler relieved Sperle of command and forced him into retirement. The man who had once commanded the respect of the Nazi leadership, who had pioneered the tactics of terror bombing, who had risen to the highest ranks of Hitler's military machine, was now just another discredited general in a crumbling empire. But unlike many of his colleagues, who chose suicide over capture as the Third Reich collapsed, Hugo Sperle decided to survive. On May 1, 1945, as Germany surrendered unconditionally, he presented himself to British forces and became a prisoner of war. For the Allied authorities, Sperl represented a significant catch. Here was one of the highest-ranking Luftwaffe officers to survive the war, a man with intimate knowledge of German air operations and, most importantly, a potential war criminal whose actions had directly affected thousands of Allied civilians. The question was, what to do with him? The decision to prosecute Hugo Sperl wasn't made immediately. Throughout 1945 and 1946, as Allied investigators compiled evidence for the major war crimes trials, Sperl remained in prison while prosecutors decided whether his case warranted inclusion in the main Nuremberg trial or one of the subsequent proceedings. Eventually, it was decided that Sperl would be tried as part of the High Command case, formerly known as the United States of America versus Wilhelm von Lieb, et this was one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, designed to prosecute German military leaders who were accused of war crimes but weren't considered important enough for the main international military tribunal. On October 30th, 1947, Hugo Sperl and 13 other German military commanders were brought before an American military tribunal in Nuremberg to face charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. We're about to dive into one of the most controversial and shocking acquittals in legal history. But before we get there, I want to ask you something. What do you think should happen to military commanders who follow illegal orders? Is just following orders ever a valid defense? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next in Sperl's trial will challenge everything you think you know about wartime justice. The case against Hugo Sperl seemed airtight. Allied prosecutors had spent over 2 years assembling what they believed was overwhelming evidence of his war crimes. They had documented his command of the Condor Legion during the bombing of Guernica. They had traced his leadership of Luftflotte 3 throughout the Battle of Britain and the London Blitz. They had testimony from survivors, intercepted German communications, and Sperl's own operational orders proving his direct involvement in attacks on civilian targets. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. Demonstrate that Hugo Sperl had systematically violated the laws of war by deliberately targeting civilian populations, and that as a senior military commander, he bore direct responsibility for the war crimes committed by units under his command. They began with Guernica. Prosecutors presented evidence that the bombing of the Basque town had no legitimate military purpose. There were no significant military installations, no strategic industries, no vital transportation hubs. The attack had been designed purely to terrorize civilians and test the psychological effects of aerial bombardment on a defenseless population. Witness after witness testified about the horror of April 26, 1937. They described how Sperl's bombers had specifically targeted the market square when it was packed with civilians. They recounted how fighter planes had strafed fleeing refugees. They provided evidence that incendiary bombs had been dropped in a systematic pattern designed to create a firestorm that would maximize casualties and destruction. The prosecution then moved to the London Blitz. They showed that Sperl's bombing campaign against British cities had deliberately targeted working-class residential neighborhoods rather than military or industrial facilities. They presented intercepted German communications, proving that the goal was to break British civilian morale through terror, not to achieve legitimate military objectives. British survivors of the Blitz took the stand to describe nights of horror under Sperl's bombing campaign. They told of families burned alive in their homes, of children killed while sleeping in supposedly safe air raid shelters, of entire communities destroyed in single nights of bombing. The prosecutors believed they had an ironclad case. Hugo Sperl had commanded forces that had deliberately murdered thousands of civilians. He had pioneered tactics of terror bombing that violated every principle of the laws of war. He had turned air power from a military weapon into an instrument of mass murder. But Hugo Sperl's defense team had a very different story to tell. Sperl's lawyers, led by experienced German attorney Hans Laternzer, built their defense around 3 key arguments. First, they claimed that Sperl was a professional military officer who had simply followed legitimate orders from his superiors. Second, they argued that the bombing campaigns he had commanded were legitimate military operations targeting enemy war-making capacity. not deliberate attacks on civilians. And third, they contended that Sperle was not a policymaker like Hermann Göring or other top Nazi leaders, but simply a field commander implementing strategies developed by others. The defense strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than denying that civilian casualties had occurred, they reframed the entire discussion. Every bombing raid, they argued, had been aimed at legitimate military targets. If civilians had been killed, it was because they lived near military installations, worked in war industries, or were simply unfortunate collateral damage in a total war where the enemy had made entire cities into legitimate targets. For Guernica, the defense claimed that the town had been a legitimate military target because it contained a bridge and railway junction that were being used to supply Republican forces. The fact that the bridge wasn't actually destroyed and that the bombing had focused on the civilian center of town was simply due to the primitive nature of aerial bombardment technology in 1937. For the London Blitz, they argued that British cities were legitimate targets because they contained war industries, ports that supported the British war effort, and transportation networks that were vital to enemy military operations. The fact that working-class residential neighborhoods had been hit was simply because Britain had deliberately placed military targets in populated areas, using civilians as human shields. But the defense's most powerful argument was about command responsibility. Sperle's lawyers argued that he was not personally responsible for individual bombing raids or specific attacks on civilian targets. As a high-level commander, they claimed, he issued general strategic directives, but the detailed planning and execution of individual missions was handled by subordinate commanders. This was a crucial point in military law. How much responsibility does a senior commander bear for crimes committed by units under his command? If a colonel orders his regiment to attack a town, and individual soldiers commit atrocities during that attack, is the colonel legally responsible for those specific crimes? The defense presented evidence that Sperle had not personally planned individual bombing raids, had not selected specific targets for attack, and had not issued explicit orders to target civilians. They portrayed him as a strategic commander who issued general directives about military objectives, while leaving the tactical details to subordinate officers. They also emphasized that Hugo Sperle was not a member of the Nazi Party, had not been involved in Holocaust operations, and had not participated in the planning of aggressive war. Unlike other defendants who were clearly part of the Nazi political apparatus, Sperle could plausibly claim to be simply a professional military officer doing his duty. But perhaps most importantly, the defense tapped into a growing unease among the Allied judges about the implications of their own decisions. By 1948, the Cold War between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was intensifying rapidly. American and British forces were already beginning to see West Germany as a potential ally against Soviet expansion. In this context, prosecuting German military officers for strategic bombing campaigns was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the Western powers. After all, Allied strategic bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. If Hugo Sperle was guilty of war crimes for bombing London, what did that say about the Allied commanders who had ordered the firebombing of Dresden or the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? The judges in the high command case were all American military, officers who had served during World War II. They were acutely aware that the precedent they set in prosecuting strategic bombing could potentially be used against American and British commanders in future conflicts. As the trial progressed through the spring and summer of 1948, it became clear that the prosecution's seemingly airtight case was running into serious legal and political obstacles. The judges were struggling to find direct evidence linking Sperle personally to specific, unlawful orders. They were uncomfortable with the implications of condemning strategic bombing as a war crime, and they were increasingly influenced by the Cold War political climate that was transforming former enemies into potential allies. On October 27, 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, survivors, and legal observers from around the world. The judges had deliberated for weeks over the cases of 14 German military commanders, including Hugo Sperle. One by one, the verdicts were read. Several defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 3 years to life imprisonment. Some were acquitted due to lack of evidence. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, on the charge of war crimes, not guilty. On the charge of crimes against humanity, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Survivors of Guernica and the London Blitz couldn't believe what they were hearing. How could a man who had commanded the systematic bombing of civilian targets simply walk free? The judges explained their reasoning in a written opinion that remains controversial to this day. They found that while civilian casualties had indeed occurred during bombing campaigns under Sperl's command, the prosecution had failed to prove that he had personally ordered attacks specifically designed to target civilians. They accepted the defense. Argument that Sperl was a field commander following strategic directives from higher authority rather than a policymaker who had developed the strategy of terror bombing. They found insufficient evidence to prove that individual bombing raids had been conducted with the specific intent to kill civilians rather than to attack legitimate military targets. Most controversially, they seemed to accept the argument that in the context of total war, the distinction between military and civilian targets had become so blurred as to be legally meaningless. If entire cities were contributing to the enemy war effort, then entire cities could be considered legitimate targets for strategic bombing. Hugo Sperl walked out of the Nuremberg courthouse a free man. Within months, he was cleared by a German denazification court and released from all restrictions on his movement and activities. He settled quietly in Bavaria, where he lived comfortably on his military pension until his death in 1953. The man who had bombed Guernica, who had terrorized London, who had pioneered the tactics of strategic bombing that would define warfare for the rest of the 20th century, never spent a single day in prison for his actions. But the implications of Sperl's acquittal extended far beyond one man's escape from justice. His trial had established legal precedents that would influence military law for decades to come. The narrow interpretation of command responsibility, the acceptance of strategic bombing as a legitimate military tactic, and the reluctance to prosecute military officers for following orders would all have profound consequences for how future war crimes would be prosecuted. Perhaps most troubling of all, Sperl's acquittal sent a clear message to military commanders around the world. If you're careful about how you word your orders, if you maintain plausible deniability about your specific intentions, and if you can argue that your actions serve some conceivable military purpose, you can commit massive war crimes and walk away unpunished. The ghost of Hugo Sperl would haunt military courtrooms for generations. From Vietnam to Bosnia to Iraq, military commanders accused of war crimes would invoke the same defenses that had set him free, just following orders. Legitimate military objectives and the fog of war. And in our modern world, where precision-guided weapons and drone strikes have made the targeting of civilians easier than ever before, the questions raised by Hugo Sperl's trial remain painfully relevant. When does a military operation become a war crime? How much responsibility do commanders bear for the actions of their subordinates? And in an age of asymmetric warfare, where the distinction between combatants and civilians is increasingly blurred, how do we maintain the legal principles that are supposed to protect innocent people from the horrors of war? Hugo Sperl's story is more than just a historical curiosity about one Nazi who escaped justice. It's a cautionary tale about the political compromises and legal precedents that can allow even the worst war criminals to slip through the cracks of international justice. It's a reminder that the pursuit of justice is always complicated by the political realities of the time, and that sometimes the demand for practical cooperation outweighs the moral imperative for accountability. Most importantly, it's a warning about the dangers of allowing military commanders to hide behind the defense of just following orders, when the orders they're following involve the deliberate targeting of innocent civilians. The next time you hear about war, crimes being committed in some distant conflict, the next time you see military commanders claiming they were just following orders, remember Hugo Sperl. Remember how one of Hitler's most ruthless air commanders walked out of Nuremberg a free man. And ask yourself, have we really learned the lessons that his escape from justice was supposed to teach us? If this deep dive into one of history's most controversial war crimes trials has opened your eyes to the complexities of international justice, then you need to see what happened to the Nazi commanders who weren't so lucky. Click here to watch our investigation into the Nuremberg trials that actually delivered justice, where high-ranking war criminals faced the full consequences of their actions. And if you believe these uncomfortable truths about history need to be told, no matter how disturbing they might be, then subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Because the stories we uncover next will show you just how thin the line between justice and politics really is in the aftermath of war.